I don't know where you're listening from. Maybe you're sweeping a hallway, checking cameras, or locking the building for the night. It doesn't matter what time it is, but I promise you, today's story will shake you to your core. Picture this. A 72-year-old man with weathered hands and kind eyes, sitting alone on cold concrete steps in the shadow of Manhattan's most prestigious financial tower. His lunch, a simple peanut butter sandwich wrapped in brown paper, trembles slightly in his grip as the autumn wind cuts through his faded navy uniform. The scent of his modest meal mingles with the crisp October air, while just 30 feet away, through gleaming glass doors, executives in $1,000 suits discuss million-dollar deals over catered lunches. His name was Henry Morrison, and for 18 years, he had been the invisible guardian of the Carlyle Financial Tower on Wall Street. To the hundreds of people who rushed past him daily, investment bankers, cryptocurrency traders, real estate moguls, Henry was nothing more than furniture. A fixture that cleaned their marble floors, emptied their wastepaper baskets filled with discarded stock reports, and ensured their elevators ran smoothly while they manipulated millions in digital assets with a few keystrokes. But Henry saw everything. Behind those gentle brown eyes, dulled by decades of being overlooked, lived a mind that cataloged every whispered conversation about insider trading, every nervous glance when quarterly reports didn't match the projected earnings, every secret meeting where Bitcoin transactions were discussed in hushed tones. He noticed which executives stayed late to shred documents, which ones received mysterious phone calls about offshore accounts, and which ones treated their assistants with kindness or cruelty. Every morning at 5:30, Henry would unlock the service entrance with keys that had worn smooth from years of faithful use. His footsteps echoed through empty hallways that would soon buzz with the energy of people chasing fortunes. He moved like a ghost through the building, his cartwheel squeaking softly against polished floors, his presence so consistent that people stopped seeing him altogether. The tower itself was a monument to wealth, 47 floors of glass and steel reaching toward the clouds, each floor representing millions of dollars in property value. The lobby featured Italian marble that cost more than most people's annual salaries, and the elevator buttons were actual gold-plated fixtures. Henry cleaned it all, his reflection barely visible in the surfaces he polished to perfection. In the basement storage room where Henry kept his supplies, a small wooden stool sat beside the industrial sink. This was where he ate his lunch for the first 17 years of his employment, away from the eyes of those who might judge his simple meals. But 6 months ago, something changed. Henry began climbing those concrete stairs outside, choosing the harsh autumn air over the warmth of his familiar corner. Henry remembered every face, every name, every cruel comment whispered just loud enough for him to hear. There was Jonathan Prescott, the hedge fund manager who made $50 million last year and complained loudly when Henry's vacuum interrupted his phone calls about diversifying his cryptocurrency portfolio. Sarah Chen managed the building's property investments worth over $200 million, yet she would step over Henry's mop bucket rather than wait 2 seconds for him to move it aside. But it was Marcus Carlyle himself, the building's owner and CEO of Carlyle Financial, who embodied the worst of the indifference Henry faced daily. Carlyle's net worth exceeded $800 million, built on a foundation of aggressive stock acquisitions, revolutionary fintech innovations, and a portfolio of Manhattan real estate that included 3 other skyscrapers. His wealth was so vast that rumor had it he kept emergency funds in gold bars and had invested heavily in Bitcoin when it was still under $1,000 per coin. The irony wasn't lost on Henry that he, who earned barely above minimum wage, was responsible for the physical integrity of a building where billions of dollars in assets were managed daily. While Carlyle's team moved millions through international markets with wireless transfers, Henry moved his mop bucket from floor to floor, ensuring their million-dollar offices remained pristine. On that particular Tuesday in October, as Henry sat on those concrete steps with his sandwich, Carlyle himself walked out of the building. For the first time in 18 years, Marcus Carlyle truly looked at Henry Morrison. Not through him, not past him, but at him. The sight of the elderly janitor eating alone on the cold steps while employees enjoyed catered meals inside struck something deep in Carlyle's chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced in decades. Henry's isolation wasn't born of choice, but of heartbreak that ran deeper than the foundation of the building itself. 23 years ago, Henry's beloved wife Martha had worked in the very same tower as head of the employee cafeteria. The small dining room on the third floor had been their sanctuary, a place where Martha would save Henry the last piece of her famous apple pie, where they would steal quiet moments together during his breaks, sharing dreams about their future retirement. Martha's recipes were legendary among the building staff. Her pot roast rivaled restaurants that charged $50 a plate, and her chocolate cake had become the unofficial celebration dessert for every promotion, every successful merger, every million-dollar deal closed. She took pride in feeding people who controlled vast fortunes, never asking for anything more than their appreciation and Henry's smile when he appeared at her serving window. But Martha's downfall came through no fault of her own. A corporate scandal erupted when someone leaked the building's employees' personal information to a competitor, including Martha's carefully guarded recipes that several high-end restaurants had offered to buy for thousands of dollars. The executives needed a scapegoat, someone without the resources or connections to fight back. Martha, with her immigrant background and limited English, became the perfect target. The accusations were swift and merciless. Despite 18 years of faithful service, despite the fact that Martha could barely operate the building's computer system, let alone steal digital files, she was terminated immediately. The company's legal team, paid more per hour than Martha earned in a month, spun a narrative that painted her as a corporate spy selling secrets to outside interests. Henry watched his wife's spirit crumble under the weight of false accusations. The woman who had fed hundreds of people with love and care was suddenly portrayed as a greedy thief in the company newsletter. The formal letter of termination, signed by Marcus Carlyle himself, cited breach of trust and corporate espionage, words that burned into Henry's memory like brands on his heart. Martha never recovered from the humiliation. She stopped cooking at home, stopped smiling, stopped believing in the goodness she had spent decades nurturing in others. Within 2 years, the stress and heartbreak manifested as a rare cancer that the doctor said was likely triggered by prolonged emotional trauma. Henry held her hand as she died, whispering apologies for not fighting harder, for not protecting her from the cruelty of those who valued profit over people. After Martha's death, Henry could never again enter that third-floor dining room. The smell of industrial coffee and reheated meals, the sound of casual laughter from people who had destroyed his wife's reputation without a second thought. It was unbearable. So he retreated to his basement corner, then eventually to those concrete steps, carrying his simple sandwiches and the weight of his grief in equal measure. The other employees noticed Henry's strange behavior, but created their own explanations. Some whispered that he thought himself too good for the dining room. Others suggested he was hiding something, maybe stealing food or supplies. The truth, that Henry Morrison's heart was too broken to sit in the place where his wife's memory lived, never occurred to anyone. Young interns like Kevin Walsh, fresh from Yale Business School and already managing a small portfolio worth $3 million, would mockingly imitate Henry's slow walk when they thought he couldn't hear. "Look at the old man," Kevin would whisper to his colleagues, "probably dreaming about his Social Security check while we're making more in bonuses than he'll see in his lifetime." Sarah Chen, despite her Harvard MBA and her management of property assets worth hundreds of millions, found Henry's presence irritating. She complained to building management that his slow pace interfered with her productivity, that his ancient uniform looked unprofessional when important clients visited their offices where billion-dollar deals were negotiated. But Henry endured it all with the same quiet dignity he had shown for decades. He arrived early, stayed late, and kept their gleaming towers spotless while they played with numbers so large most people couldn't comprehend them. His paycheck, barely enough to cover his modest studio apartment in Queens, was deposited automatically every 2 weeks while the people around him discussed stock options worth more than entire neighborhoods. The building itself seemed to respond to Henry's presence. Elevators ran smoothly under his maintenance, floors gleamed under his careful attention, and the security systems hummed quietly thanks to his daily checks. He was the invisible foundation upon which their glass tower of wealth was built, yet he remained as overlooked as the concrete and steel that supported their million-dollar offices. As autumn deepened and Henry continued eating his simple lunches on those cold steps, a few observant employees began to wonder about his story. Maria Santos, who managed client relations for Carlyle Financial's international division, sometimes noticed how Henry's eyes would linger on the third-floor windows. She couldn't know that he was looking at the place where Martha once smiled at him through the serving window. Couldn't know that every day he chose those cold steps was another day he honored his wife's memory by refusing to forget the injustice done to her. The building's security guard, James Crawford, had worked there almost as long as Henry and sometimes shared a nod or quiet greeting. James noticed how Henry's hands shook slightly when he held his sandwich, how the old man's breath created small clouds in the cold air, how he never complained despite the obvious discomfort of eating outside in October weather. But most people remained oblivious to Henry's sacrifice, his loyalty, his broken heart that beat steadily behind his faded uniform. They saw only an old janitor who made strange choices, not understanding that sometimes love involves honoring pain, that sometimes choosing difficulty over comfort is the only way to keep precious memories alive. On a bitter Thursday morning in November, everything changed for Henry Morrison. The day began like any other, arriving before dawn, unlocking doors, beginning his methodical cleaning routine while the city slowly awakened around him. But as he emptied the waste paper basket in Jonathan Prescott's office, he noticed something unusual. A small velvet jewelry box tucked beneath discarded cryptocurrency white papers and stock analysis reports. Henry's initial instinct was to set it aside for Prescott to claim later. As the building's custodian, he occasionally found forgotten items, expensive watches, gold cufflinks, silver tie clips, that he would dutifully turn in to building security. As he lifted the box, it opened slightly, revealing a stunning diamond bracelet that sparkled even in the dim office lighting. The piece was clearly worth more than Henry's annual salary, possibly more than all his worldly possessions combined. Following protocol, Henry immediately took the bracelet to James Crawford at the security desk. The jewelry was logged, photographed, and locked in the building's lost and found safe while they waited for someone to claim it. Henry thought nothing more about it until 2 days later, when Rebecca Thornton, Marcus Carlyle's personal assistant, reported her grandmother's antique diamond bracelet missing. Rebecca was distraught. The bracelet, worth over $40,000, was a family heirloom passed down through 4 generations. She had worn it to the previous day's board meeting, a presentation about Carlyle Financial's expansion into the cryptocurrency market, where they discussed moving $50 million in assets into digital currencies. After the meeting, she had placed it in her desk drawer for safekeeping, but when she looked for it the next morning, it was gone. The building's management immediately launched an investigation. Security footage was reviewed, access logs were checked, and interviews were conducted. But as the investigation progressed, an uncomfortable truth emerged. Only 3 people had been in Rebecca's office after the board meeting. Rebecca herself, Sarah Chen, who had delivered some international property transfer documents, and Henry Morrison, who had emptied the wastebaskets during his evening cleaning routine. Rebecca was above suspicion. She was the victim. Sarah Chen's alibi was ironclad. Security cameras showed her leaving the building immediately after delivering the documents, and her personal net worth exceeded $2 million from successful real estate investments. That left Henry, whose minimal wages and humble lifestyle made him appear desperate in the eyes of those conducting the investigation. The accusations came swiftly and without mercy. Jonathan Prescott, the same man in whose office Henry had found the bracelet, led the charge. "It's obvious," he declared during an impromptu meeting in Carlyle's office. The old man finally decided to supplement his pathetic income. Probably figured one little bracelet wouldn't be missed among all our assets. Sarah Chen nodded in agreement. "I've always found his behavior suspicious," she lied smoothly. "The way he lurks around our offices, listening to our conversations about stock portfolios and investment strategies. He probably knows exactly how much money flows through this building and decided to take his share." Marcus Carlyle, surrounded by the trappings of his $800 million empire, listened as his employees painted Henry as a common thief. The irony was lost on all of them. They were discussing the character of a man who earned less in a year than they spent on business lunches, while sitting in an office that cost more to furnish than Henry's lifetime earnings. The damning evidence seemed overwhelming. Henry had access to the office, he had been seen near Rebecca's desk area, and most convincingly, he was the one who found the bracelet in Prescott's office. The investigators theorized that Henry had stolen the bracelet, but when the heat of the investigation intensified, he had panicked and planted it in another office to throw off suspicion. Henry sat in the building's conference room, surrounded by people whose combined net worth exceeded $1 billion, as they pronounced him guilty of theft. His weathered hands folded in his lap, his tired eyes focused on the polished mahogany table that cost more than most people's cars. He tried to explain that he had simply found the bracelet and immediately reported it, but his words fell on deaf ears. "Mr. Morrison," Marcus Carlyle said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who controlled vast financial empires, "we have clear evidence that you were the last person in Rebecca's office before the bracelet went missing. You had means, motive, and opportunity." Henry's voice, rarely heard above a whisper in his years of service, cracked slightly as he spoke. "Sir, I've worked here for 18 years. I've never taken so much as a coffee stirrer that wasn't mine. I found the bracelet and turned it in immediately because that's what honest people do." But his honesty was mistaken for desperation, his humility interpreted as guilt. Jonathan Prescott leaned back in his leather chair, the same chair where he conducted million-dollar cryptocurrency transactions, and shook his head sadly. "Henry, the evidence speaks for itself. We all know the pressures of making ends meet on a janitor's salary. No one here would blame you for being tempted by something worth more than you make in a year." The condescension in Prescott's voice was suffocating. Here was a man whose bonus last year exceeded Henry's total lifetime earnings, speaking about financial pressure to someone who had worked for decades without complaint. The moral blindness was staggering. They could conceive of every complex financial instrument, every sophisticated investment strategy, but they couldn't imagine that integrity might exist in a man who wore a used uniform and carried his lunch in a brown paper bag. Rebecca Thornton, perhaps feeling guilty about the situation, tried to offer a softer approach. "Henry, if you just tell us where the bracelet is now, we can work something out. Maybe you were just borrowing it, planning to return it." These things happen. Even her kindness was poisoned with assumption. The notion that Henry Morrison, who had spent 18 years maintaining their pristine environment without a single complaint, who had never asked for a raise or called in sick, who had absorbed their daily indignities with quiet grace, would suddenly become a thief was accepted without question. The final verdict came from Marcus Carlyle himself: immediate termination without severance pay and a notation in Henry's permanent record that would make future employment nearly impossible. "We won't press criminal charges this time," Carlyle announced magnanimously, as if he were granting a royal pardon instead of destroying a man's livelihood based on speculation and prejudice. Henry Morrison, 72 years old with arthritic joints and a heart condition, was escorted from the building by security. His small collection of personal items, a coffee mug Martha had given him, a small radio, and a worn photograph of his late wife, was packed into a cardboard box. As he walked through the lobby for the last time, Past the Italian marble and gold fixtures his labor had maintained, no one met his eyes. The humiliation was complete, but it was also the catalyst for something Marcus Carlyle and his associates couldn't have anticipated. As Henry cleaned out his custodial closet, his arthritis-stiffened fingers automatically reached for his keyring, a habit ingrained by 18 years of faithful service. Among the returned keys was one small card that went unnoticed by the security guard watching him pack, a backup access card for the building's digital security system that Henry had forgotten he possessed. That night, Henry Morrison sat in his modest studio apartment in Queens, surrounded by the remnants of his terminated career. The savings account that was supposed to carry him through retirement until Social Security kicked in would now have to sustain him while he looked for work at 72, a nearly impossible task for someone branded as a thief. But in his coat pocket, forgotten in the chaos of his dismissal, sat a small plastic card that would ultimately reveal the biggest theft in Carlyle Financial Tower's history. As Henry tried to sleep in his narrow bed, the city lights filtering through his small window, he couldn't know that his 18 years of invisible service had given him something more valuable than the fortune they accused him of stealing. He had learned to see the truth that hides behind expensive suits and impressive offices, and soon that truth would set more than just his own reputation free. Marcus Carlyle stood in his corner office 60 floors above the street, gazing out at Manhattan's glittering skyline where billions of dollars flowed through fiber optic cables every second. His empire stretched across continents, cryptocurrency exchanges in Singapore, property developments in Dubai, technology investments in Silicon Valley that had multiplied his wealth beyond comprehension. Yet for the first time in decades, his perfectly ordered world felt unstable. The dismissal of Henry Morrison should have been a minor footnote in the building's operations, like replacing a burnt-out light bulb or updating outdated software. But within weeks of the old janitor's departure, a series of small problems began cascading into larger concerns. The building's pristine appearance started showing cracks that seemed to mirror Marcus's growing unease. It began with the elevators. Without Henry's daily maintenance checks and intuitive understanding of the building's mechanical rhythms, the elevator system began developing subtle glitches. Delays of 30 seconds became minute-long waits, then complete breakdowns that trapped wealthy clients between floors while they frantically tried to complete million-dollar transactions on their phones. Jonathan Prescott, whose cryptocurrency portfolio had grown to over $20 million, found himself stuck in Elevator B for 45 minutes during a critical Bitcoin trading window. The malfunction cost him nearly $200,000 in missed opportunities, as the digital currency's value fluctuated wildly during his imprisonment. His angry complaints echoed through the executive floors as he demanded to know why the building's maintenance standards had so suddenly deteriorated. Sarah Chen faced her own crisis when the building's climate control system began malfunctioning in her office. The temperature swings wreaked havoc on her computer servers that managed property portfolios worth hundreds of millions of dollars. A brief system overheating resulted in corrupted data files that took days to restore, nearly derailing a $50 million international property acquisition she had been orchestrating for months. The building's security system, which Henry had monitored and maintained with the gentle touch of long familiarity, began generating false alarms and mysterious gaps in surveillance coverage. Expensive security consultants were brought in at enormous cost, but they couldn't replicate Henry's intuitive understanding of the system's quirks and needs. Most disturbing of all was the building's overall atmosphere. The replacement custodial staff, efficient but impersonal, cleaned surfaces but somehow missed the soul of maintenance that Henry had provided. Wealthy clients began commenting that the building felt different, colder, less welcoming, somehow diminished despite its continued luxury. Marcus found himself thinking about Henry Morrison at unexpected moments. The image of the old man eating alone on those concrete steps haunted his thoughts during board meetings where they casually discussed assets worth more than small nations' GDP. Why had Henry chosen those cold steps over the comfort of indoor dining? The question gnawed at Marcus with an intensity that surprised him. The mystery deepened when Rebecca Thornton, guilt-ridden over her role in Henry's dismissal, began her own quiet investigation. Her grandmother's diamond bracelet had been recovered, but questions lingered about how it had arrived in Jonathan Prescott's office. While reviewing her calendar and notes from that fateful day, she noticed something that had been overlooked in the initial investigation. Rebecca's detailed scheduling records showed that after the board meeting about cryptocurrency investments, she had indeed placed her bracelet in her desk drawer for safekeeping. But her notes also revealed that she had stepped out of her office for nearly an hour to attend an emergency conference call about fluctuating Bitcoin prices. During that time, according to the building's access logs, 3 people had entered her office area. Henry on his regular cleaning schedule, Sarah Chen with property documents, and surprisingly, Jonathan Prescott himself. Prescott's presence hadn't been mentioned during the investigation. When Rebecca quietly asked him about it, his explanation was casual but oddly defensive. He claimed he had been looking for some mislaid stock analysis reports, but couldn't explain why he hadn't mentioned this during Henry's interrogation. Meanwhile, Henry Morrison was discovering that life after Carlisle Financial Tower was both harder and more revealing than he had expected. His reputation as a suspected thief made finding new employment nearly impossible. Building managers would start interviews with enthusiasm. His experience was extensive, his references from previous jobs impeccable, but conversations would end abruptly when they called Carlisle Financial for verification. Henry spent his days walking through Queens, picking up odd jobs that barely covered his rent and medication costs. He helped elderly neighbors with grocery shopping, cleaned windows for small businesses, and swept sidewalks for store owners who paid him in cash and kindness. The work was inconsistent, but it kept him moving and gave purpose to days that might otherwise have been consumed by bitterness. During one of these walks, Henry encountered Maria Santos from Carlisle Financial at a small coffee shop near the Queens Public Library. Maria, who managed international client relations and whose sharp mind oversaw transactions worth tens of millions, was visiting her elderly mother in the neighborhood. She barely recognized Henry without his custodial uniform, dressed in worn civilian clothes and looking smaller somehow, diminished by circumstances, but not by dignity. Their conversation was brief but illuminating. Maria expressed surprise at seeing Henry and awkward condolences about his situation. But as they talked, she found herself remembering small details about Henry's character that the investigation had ignored. She recalled how he had once found her lost engagement ring in a wastepaper basket and had spent his entire lunch break searching for her to return it. She remembered his quiet courtesy, his gentle manner with the building's elderly visitors, his obvious pride in maintaining their workspace. "Henry," she said carefully, "I never really believed you stole that bracelet. It just didn't seem like something you would do." Henry's response was typical of his character. No anger, no plea for vindication, just quiet acceptance. "I understand why people thought what they did, Mrs. Santos. Sometimes appearances matter more than truth. I just hope whoever really took Mrs. Thornton's bracelet knows that someone else paid the price for their action." His words haunted Maria long after their chance encounter. That evening, she found herself reviewing her own memories of that day when the bracelet disappeared. Like Rebecca, she had been in the office area during the crucial time period, delivering quarterly reports about international property investments. Her trained mind, accustomed to tracking complex financial transactions across multiple time zones, began constructing a timeline that revealed inconsistencies in the official narrative. The more Maria thought about it, the more certain she became that Henry Morrison had been wronged. But proving his innocence would require more than hunches and memories. It would require evidence. and unknown to everyone at Carlyle Financial, Henry Morrison possessed exactly that kind of evidence, tucked away in his coat pocket in the form of a forgotten security access card. As winter deepened over New York City, the problems at Carlyle Financial Tower continued to multiply. The building that had once run with the precision of a Swiss watch now operated with the unpredictability of a machine missing essential parts. Marcus Carlyle, despite his vast wealth and powerful connections, found himself unable to restore the seamless functionality that Henry Morrison had provided through simple dedication and care. The financial implications were staggering. Lost productivity from elevator breakdowns, computer system failures, and general maintenance issues was costing the company millions in missed opportunities and client dissatisfaction. Prestigious tenants began questioning whether they should relocate their operations to buildings with more reliable infrastructure. But the true cost went beyond dollars and cents. Marcus Carlyle was discovering that when you destroy a good man's reputation based on assumptions and prejudice, the moral debt creates interest that compounds daily. Every night when he gazed out at the city lights from his $1 million office, he found himself wondering about Henry Morrison and whether justice had truly been served in the gleaming halls of Carlyle Financial Tower. On a cold Tuesday evening in December, 6 months after Henry Morrison had been escorted from Carlyle Financial Tower, the truth finally began its emergence from the shadows where it had been hiding. Henry sat in his cramped apartment, sorting through bills and job applications by the light of a single lamp, when his arthritic fingers brushed against something unexpected in his coat pocket, the small security access card he had forgotten during his hurried departure. The discovery brought back a flood of memories from his 18 years as the building's guardian. That card had given him access to the security monitoring system, a responsibility he had carried with the same quiet diligence as all his other duties. Henry remembered countless nights when he would check the digital surveillance feeds, ensuring that the building's wealthy occupants and their assets were protected while they slept safely in their expensive homes. A thought occurred to him, a possibility so simple yet profound that it took his breath away. The building's security system didn't just monitor current activity. It stored footage for extended periods to comply with federal regulations governing financial institutions. If the system still held recordings from the day Rebecca Thornton's bracelet disappeared, they might reveal the truth that had been obscured by prejudice and assumption. Henry's decision to return to Carlyle Financial Tower wasn't driven by vengeance or anger, but by the same moral imperative that had guided his entire life. The belief that truth matters more than comfort, that justice is worth pursuing even when the odds seem impossible. Using his forgotten access card was technically a violation of his termination agreement, but Henry Morrison had lived his entire life by a code that valued honor over legality when the two conflicted. Late that Tuesday night, Henry made his way through Queens and into Manhattan, his elderly frame moving slowly but determinedly through the December cold. The city hummed around him with its ceaseless energy. Late-night traders managing international cryptocurrency portfolios, security guards protecting billions in assets, and delivery trucks carrying goods worth more than most people's annual salaries. Carlyle Financial Tower stood like a gleaming monument to wealth and power, its windows reflecting the city lights while hiding the secrets contained within its walls. Henry approached the service entrance he had used for 18 years, his weathered hand trembling slightly as he inserted the forgotten security card. For a moment that felt like eternity, he wondered if the access had been revoked, if his quiet mission would end before it began. The light turned green. The lock clicked open. Henry Morrison stepped back into the building where he had spent his career maintaining other people's empires, returning now not as an employee, but as a seeker of truth. The security monitoring room was located in the building's basement, a maze of corridors that Henry could navigate blindfolded after nearly 2 decades of service. His footsteps echoed softly against polished concrete as he made his way through the familiar darkness, past storage rooms filled with supplies worth more than most families' monthly budgets. The monitoring room itself was a testament to modern surveillance technology. Banks of screens displaying feeds from dozens of cameras, digital storage systems containing terabytes of recorded footage, and computer terminals that tracked every access card entry and exit throughout the building. It was here that Henry had spent countless quiet hours watching over the sleeping empire like a faithful guardian. Finding the right footage required patience and an understanding of the system that Henry had developed over years of operation. The date he needed, November 15th, the day of Rebecca Thornton's board meeting and the mysterious disappearance of her grandmother's diamond bracelet, was stored in the digital archives, waiting to reveal its secrets to anyone who knew how to access them. Henry's fingers, still steady despite his age, navigated the complex interface with the muscle memory of long practice. Camera by camera, hour by hour, he began reconstructing the events of that fateful day. The footage revealed a story far different from the narrative that had cost him his livelihood and reputation. The security recordings showed Rebecca Thornton leaving her office at 2:47 p.m. to attend the emergency cryptocurrency conference call, her grandmother's bracelet clearly visible on her wrist. At 3:15 p.m., Henry Morrison appeared on camera, following his regular cleaning schedule, emptying wastebaskets and tidying offices with the same methodical care he had shown for 18 years. The timestamp showed he was in Rebecca's office for exactly 4 minutes and 37 seconds, barely enough time to complete his assigned duties, let alone search for valuable jewelry to steal. But at 3:52 p.m., nearly 40 minutes after Henry had completed his work and moved to other floors, another figure appeared in the hallway outside Rebecca's office. Jonathan Prescott, whose cryptocurrency portfolio had made him wealthier than some small countries, was clearly visible entering the office area. The camera angle captured him looking around nervously before disappearing from view into Rebecca's office. Henry's heart pounded as he continued watching the digital reconstruction of events. 12 minutes later, Prescott emerged from Rebecca's office, his body language completely different, hurried, anxious, clearly carrying something small in his closed fist. The footage followed him as he moved through the building's corridors, ultimately arriving at his own office where the cameras showed him placing a small object into his desk drawer. The final piece of evidence came from the next day's footage. As building security began investigating the missing bracelet, Prescott was captured on camera retrieving the small object from his desk and placing it beneath papers in his wastebasket, the same wastebasket where Henry would discover it during his regular cleaning routine, unknowingly becoming part of an elaborate frame-up designed to make him appear guilty of the very theft that Prescott himself had committed. Henry sat back in the monitoring room chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what the footage revealed. Jonathan Prescott, worth millions from his cryptocurrency investments and stock market manipulations, had stolen a $40,000 bracelet not out of financial desperation, but apparently for the thrill of taking something precious from a colleague. More damning still, he had deliberately implicated an innocent man, allowing Henry's reputation and livelihood to be destroyed to cover his own inexplicable crime. The moral arithmetic was staggering. A man worth $20 million had destroyed the life of a 72-year-old janitor to hide a theft that represented less than 1% of his annual income. The casual cruelty of it took Henry's breath away, not just the initial theft, but the calculated decision to let someone else suffer the consequences. Henry carefully copied the relevant footage onto a portable drive, his movements methodical and precise despite the emotional weight of his discoveries. The evidence was incontrovertible, multiple camera angles, clear timestamps, and Prescott's own actions captured in high-definition digital clarity. After 6 months of carrying the burden of false accusations, Henry Morrison finally held proof of his innocence and the identity of the real thief. But as he prepared to leave the monitoring room, Henry made a discovery that went far beyond simple vindication. While copying the security footage, He had noticed other irregularities in the building's digital records: late-night access by multiple executives, mysterious meetings in supposedly empty offices, and patterns of behavior that suggested Prescott's theft of the bracelet was only the smallest part of a much larger web of deception. Over the following weeks, Henry used his copied footage and forgotten access card to conduct a quiet investigation that revealed the true scope of corruption within Carlyle Financial Tower. The building's wealthy tenants weren't just managing legitimate investments in property holdings. Several were involved in sophisticated financial crimes that made Rebecca's stolen bracelet seem trivial by comparison. Jonathan Prescott's cryptocurrency activities included money laundering operations disguised as legitimate trading, moving millions of dollars in illegal funds through blockchain transactions designed to hide their criminal origins. Sarah Chen's international property investments were actually fronts for transferring assets to offshore tax havens, depriving the government of millions in revenue while enriching already wealthy clients. Most shocking of all, Marcus Carlyle himself was aware of at least some of these activities. Security footage showed late-night meetings where briefcases changed hands, where computer files were transferred to encrypted drives, and where decisions were made that prioritized profit over legality. The man who had fired Henry for allegedly stealing $40,000 was overseeing financial crimes worth hundreds of millions. Henry Morrison, the supposedly simple janitor who earned minimum wage while cleaning offices where billion-dollar assets were managed, had uncovered one of the largest financial fraud conspiracies in New York City's history. His 18 years of invisible service, of being overlooked and dismissed, had given him access to secrets that law enforcement agencies had been trying unsuccessfully to penetrate for years. The weight of this knowledge was almost too much for Henry's elderly shoulders to bear. He understood that revealing what he had learned would not only vindicate his own reputation, but would also bring down some of the most powerful people in Manhattan's financial district. The decision he faced was enormous: remain silent and let injustice continue, or speak truth to power and face the consequences of challenging people whose resources vastly exceeded his own. As Henry sat in his modest apartment, surrounded by the evidence of massive corruption, he thought about Martha and the principles that had guided their simple but honest life together. They had never owned stocks or cryptocurrency, never managed property portfolios or international investments. Their wealth had been measured in different currency: integrity, kindness, dedication to work well done, and love that lasted beyond death. The choice, when it came, was actually quite simple for Henry Morrison. On a cold morning in March, 7 months after his wrongful termination, he walked into the FBI's New York field office carrying a portable drive that would reshape Manhattan's financial landscape and restore his own reputation in ways he had never imagined possible. The FBI's white-collar crime unit had been investigating suspicious activities at several Manhattan financial firms for over 2 years, but their efforts had been frustrated by sophisticated security systems and the silence of insiders who were either complicit or too intimidated to speak. When 72-year-old Henry Morrison walked into their offices with detailed security footage and his quiet testimony about 18 years of observation, it was like receiving a master key to unlock mysteries that had confounded federal investigators. Special Agent Angela Rodriguez, a 15-year veteran of white-collar crime investigation, initially approached Henry's story with professional skepticism. Financial fraud cases were notoriously complex, requiring years to build and often collapsing due to insufficient evidence or witness reluctance to testify. But as she reviewed Henry's footage and listened to his methodical recounting of suspicious activities he had observed over nearly 2 decades, she realized she was dealing with the most comprehensive financial crime evidence she had ever encountered. The security footage Henry provided was devastating in its clarity. Jonathan Prescott's theft of Rebecca Thornton's bracelet was merely the appetizer to a feast of criminality that included money laundering through cryptocurrency exchanges, tax evasion through false property valuations, and investment fraud that had bilked clients out of hundreds of millions of dollars. The timestamps on the recordings correlated perfectly with suspicious financial transactions that the FBI had been tracking through other investigations. Agent Rodriguez assembled a task force that included experts from multiple federal agencies: the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Internal Revenue Service, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, and specialized units dealing with cryptocurrency crimes. The evidence Henry provided gave them probable cause for search warrants that would have been impossible to obtain through conventional investigation methods. Meanwhile, Marcus Carlyle's empire was beginning to crumble from within, weakened by the very corruption that Henry's footage had revealed. Clients whose portfolios had been manipulated were discovering discrepancies in their accounts. International property deals structured to evade taxes were attracting attention from multiple government agencies. Cryptocurrency transactions designed to hide money laundering were being traced through blockchain analysis tools that made digital anonymity increasingly difficult to maintain. The first arrests came on a Tuesday morning in April, exactly 1 year after Henry Morrison had been wrongfully terminated from Carlyle Financial Tower. Federal agents arrived at the gleaming building with enough search warrants to examine every computer, every file, and every financial record maintained by the various firms operating within its walls. Jonathan Prescott was taken into custody at his $1 million Manhattan apartment, found attempting to transfer cryptocurrency holdings to offshore accounts beyond the reach of U.S. law enforcement. The man who had stolen Rebecca's bracelet for inexplicable reasons, then destroyed an innocent man's reputation to cover his crime, was now facing federal charges that could result in decades in prison and the forfeiture of his entire $20 million fortune. Sarah Chen was arrested at LaGuardia Airport, boarding a flight to Singapore with encrypted hard drives containing client financial records and $2 million in cryptocurrency stored on hardware wallets. Her sophisticated international property investment schemes had been revealed as elaborate tax evasion conspiracies that had cheated federal and state governments out of tens of millions in revenue. Marcus Carlyle himself faced the most serious charges. The FBI's investigation revealed that his $800 million empire had been built partially on fraudulent activities dating back over a decade. His legitimate investments and property holdings were entangled with money laundering operations, tax fraud schemes, and investment scams that had victimized everyone from pension funds to individual retirement accounts. The irony was profound and biblical in its scope. Men who possessed more wealth than entire cities had risked everything for additional millions that they could never spend in a lifetime, while the humble janitor they had destroyed possessed the moral clarity to choose justice over comfort, truth over silence. Henry Morrison's minimum wage perspective had given him insights into character and consequence that all their financial education had failed to provide. Rebecca Thornton, whose grandmother's stolen bracelet had inadvertently triggered the investigation, found herself in the surreal position of being both a crime victim and a potential witness in one of the largest financial fraud cases in federal court history. The $40,000 bracelet that had cost Henry his job was insignificant compared to the hundreds of millions in criminal assets that her colleagues had been managing, but its theft had pulled the thread that unraveled the entire conspiracy. As federal agents cataloged evidence from Carlyle Financial Tower, they discovered that Henry Morrison's 18 years of observation had made him the most valuable witness in their possession. His detailed knowledge of the building's routines, his ability to recognize behavioral patterns among the executives, and his careful memory for dates and incidents provided crucial corroboration for the digital evidence they had seized. The man who had been dismissed as a simple janitor, too old and uneducated to understand the complexities of modern finance, had actually been the most observant analyst in the building. While cryptocurrency traders and investment managers manipulated numbers on their screens, Henry had been studying the human element, The nervous glances, the whispered conversations, the late-night meetings that revealed character flaws that no financial model could predict. Agent Rodriguez found herself developing deep respect for Henry Morrison's quiet intelligence and unshakable integrity. During hours of interviews as the federal case developed, she observed that his memory was remarkably precise, his moral reasoning was sophisticated, and his courage in coming forward despite the personal risks was genuinely heroic. This elderly man in worn clothing possessed qualities of character that were apparently rare among people who managed billion-dollar portfolios. The media attention surrounding the federal arrests transformed Henry Morrison from an invisible custodian into a symbol of moral courage, standing up to institutional corruption. News reporters discovered the human story behind the financial crimes, an elderly janitor wrongfully accused of theft who had quietly gathered evidence that brought down some of Manhattan's most powerful financial criminals. The David versus Goliath narrative captured public imagination in ways that abstract discussions of white-collar crime never could. But for Henry himself, the vindication felt less important than the simple restoration of his reputation and the knowledge that truth had finally emerged from the shadows where it had been hiding. He had never sought wealth or power, had never wanted anything more than honest work and the respect that honest work deserves. Now, at 73, he found himself at the center of a federal case that would reshape how financial crimes were investigated and prosecuted. The most satisfying moment came when Marcus Carlyle, facing the collapse of his empire and the prospect of decades in federal prison, requested a private meeting with Henry Morrison. The man who had once commanded $800 million in assets, who had fired Henry based on prejudiced assumptions, now needed to face the person whose dignity he had destroyed and whose evidence had revealed the truth about his criminal enterprise. Marcus Carlyle sat across from Henry Morrison in a small conference room at the federal courthouse, the contrast between them more stark than ever, despite the complete reversal of their circumstances. Carlyle, wearing the expensive suit of a man whose wealth was being systematically seized by federal agents, faced the elderly janitor whose quiet integrity had brought truth to light. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of injustice acknowledged and power humbled. Marcus had rehearsed this moment in his mind countless times since his arrest, searching for words adequate to address the magnitude of his moral failure. How do you apologize to someone whose life you destroyed based on arrogant assumptions? How do you restore dignity to a person you never bothered to see as fully human? Henry Morrison, dressed in his simple civilian clothes, waited with the same patient silence he had maintained throughout 18 years of invisible service. His weathered hands, still steady despite his age, rested calmly on the table between them. The same hands that had cleaned Marcus's office, that had maintained the building where Marcus's criminal enterprise had flourished, that had ultimately gathered the evidence bringing Marcus to justice. "Mr. Morrison," Marcus finally began, his voice lacking the arrogant authority that had once commanded boardrooms and intimidated subordinates, "I don't know how to begin making amends for what I did to you." Henry's response was typical of his character, measured, thoughtful, without anger, despite having every right to rage at the injustice he had endured. "Mr. Carlyle, I never wanted anything from you except fair treatment. I worked hard for 18 years, and when something went wrong, you decided I must be guilty because I was poor and old and didn't have the resources to fight back." The simple truth of Henry's words hit Marcus harder than any accusation could have. He saw now what his arrogance had blinded him to before, the quiet dignity of a man who had never asked for special treatment, only for basic human respect. Henry Morrison had been the most honorable person in Carlyle Financial Tower, yet Marcus had suspected him first, and most readily, because his minimum wage job made him appear desperate to people who couldn't imagine integrity existing without wealth. "You're right," Marcus admitted, his voice barely audible. "I saw what I expected to see instead of looking at who you actually were. I destroyed your reputation based on my own prejudices, and I need you to know that I understand how wrong that was." Henry nodded slowly, accepting the apology without dramatics or demands for additional penance. His forgiveness came not from weakness, but from the strength that comes with knowing your own moral worth regardless of what others think. He had lived his entire life by principles that remained consistent, whether he was praised or condemned, employed or jobless, visible or invisible to those around him. "Mr. Carlyle, I appreciate you telling me this," Henry replied. "I hope when this is over you'll remember that people's worth isn't measured by their salary or their title. There are honest people in every walk of life, and there are dishonest people in every walk of life. Money doesn't change character, it just reveals it." The conversation continued for nearly an hour, with Marcus learning more about Henry Morrison in one sitting than he had discovered during 18 years of employing him. Henry spoke about Martha, about his pride in maintaining the building well, about his quiet satisfaction in work that served others even when those others never acknowledged his contributions. Marcus found himself understanding that Henry's isolation on those concrete steps hadn't been antisocial behavior, but a form of memorial to his beloved wife, whose memory had been dishonored by the same building where Marcus had built his empire. The dining room that Henry avoided wasn't just a staff cafeteria, but a sacred space where love had flourished before being destroyed by corporate cruelty and convenient scapegoating. As their meeting concluded, Marcus made a commitment that went beyond simple apology. "Mr. Morrison, I know nothing I do can undo the damage I caused, but I want to make sure you're taken care of for the rest of your life. Whatever I have left after the government seizes my assets, I want you to know that part of it will be dedicated to ensuring your comfort and dignity." Henry's response revealed the character that had made him a hero to federal investigators and a symbol of moral courage to media observers. "Mr. Carlyle, I don't need your money. What I needed was your respect, and you've given me that today. The only thing I want is for you to treat the next person better than you treated me. Remember that everyone deserves to be seen, everyone deserves to be heard, and everyone deserves fairness regardless of their circumstances." The meeting between Marcus Carlyle and Henry Morrison became a legend within the federal courthouse, whispered about by prosecutors and defense attorneys as an example of grace under pressure and dignity in the face of injustice. Here was a man who had lost everything through another's prejudice, who held evidence that had brought down a criminal empire, yet whose primary concern remained moral rather than material. As Henry left the courthouse that day, he carried with him the satisfaction of knowing that truth had prevailed and justice had been served. But more importantly, he carried the knowledge that his 18 years of faithful, invisible service had ultimately mattered in ways he could never have imagined. The building's humble guardian had become its moral conscience, the custodian who had cleaned more than floors. He had cleaned house of corruption and restored integrity to a place where it had been forgotten. 3 months later, Henry Morrison found himself standing in the marble lobby of Carlyle Financial Tower once again, but this time as an honored guest rather than an ignored employee. The building had been purchased by a coalition of ethical investment firms who were determined to restore its reputation and operate it according to the highest standards of financial integrity. The new management had extended a formal invitation to Henry, asking him to accept a position as Director of Building Integrity, a role that recognized his unique understanding of the facility and his proven commitment to truth and accountability. At 73, Henry Morrison was being offered more respect and responsibility than he had ever imagined possible during his years of invisible service. Rebecca Thornton, whose stolen bracelet had inadvertently triggered the investigation that changed everything, approached Henry in the lobby where he had once been dismissed as furniture. Her grandmother's diamond bracelet now seemed insignificant compared to the hundreds of millions in criminal assets that had been recovered, but she understood that its theft had served a larger purpose in revealing truth. "Mr. Morrison," she said with genuine respect, I want to thank you for what you did. You could have stayed silent after what happened to you, but you chose to do the right thing even when it was difficult. That took real courage." Henry's response was characteristically humble. "Mrs. Thornton, I just did what anyone would do when they saw something wrong." The real heroes were the federal agents who put together the case and made sure justice was served. But Rebecca and everyone else who knew the story understood that Henry's contribution had been far more than simply providing evidence. He had demonstrated that moral courage exists independent of wealth or power, that integrity can persist despite humiliation and hardship, and that sometimes the most unlikely person holds the key to justice. The formal ceremony recognizing Henry's new role drew dozens of people who had never bothered to acknowledge his existence during his previous employment. FBI agents who had worked with him described his cooperation and character in glowing terms. Federal prosecutors praised his precision and reliability as a witness. Building tenants who had previously looked through him now spoke respectfully about his years of dedicated service. But the most meaningful moment came when Maria Santos, the international client relations manager who had encountered Henry in that Queens coffee shop, stood to address the gathering. Her words captured what many others had felt, but struggled to express. "For 18 years, Henry Morrison was invisible to most of us," she said, her voice carrying emotion that reflected the collective guilt and admiration of everyone present. "We saw him every day, but we didn't see him. He cleaned our offices, maintained our building, and kept our work environment functioning. But we treated him like he was part of the furniture, instead of recognizing him as a person with wisdom, dignity, and valuable insights." She paused, looking directly at Henry before continuing. "The investigation that brought justice to this building happened because Henry Morrison chose truth over comfort, chose courage over silence, and chose doing right over getting even. Those are choices that reveal character, and his character turned out to be stronger than all the money and power that was operating in this building." Henry's acceptance speech was brief and reflected the same quiet wisdom that had guided his entire life. "I want to thank everyone for this opportunity, but I also want to remind everyone that what happened here could happen anywhere. When we stop seeing each other as human beings, when we let prejudice and assumptions guide our judgments, when we value wealth more than character, we create the conditions where injustice can flourish." He gestured toward the gleaming lobby around them, the marble floors he had polished for nearly 2 decades, the gold fixtures that had reflected his invisible labor. "This building is beautiful, but its real value comes from the people who work here and the integrity they bring to their work. No amount of luxury can compensate for the lack of basic human decency and fairness." The ceremony concluded with Henry receiving keys to his new office, not the basement custodial closet where he had eaten lunch in isolation, but a respectable workspace with windows that looked out over the city he had served faithfully for so many years. For the first time in his adult life, Henry Morrison had an office where he could eat lunch in dignity, surrounded by respect rather than indifference. But perhaps the most symbolic moment came when Henry was invited to have lunch in the third-floor dining room, the same space he had avoided for years out of loyalty to Martha's memory and grief over her unjust treatment. The new management had renamed it the Martha Morrison Memorial Dining Hall, honoring both Henry's late wife and the principles of fairness and respect that her story represented. Henry sat at a table by the window, looking out at the concrete steps where he had eaten so many lonely lunches, and felt Martha's presence with him in a way that was comforting rather than painful. The isolation and injustice were finished. The truth had been revealed. Dignity had been restored not just to his own reputation, but to the memory of the woman who had shared his values and his commitment to treating all people with kindness. As autumn returned to New York City, Henry Morrison settled into his new role with the same quiet dedication he had brought to his previous work. But now his observations and insights were welcomed rather than ignored. His experience was valued rather than dismissed, and his presence was acknowledged rather than invisible. The story of the humble janitor who brought down a criminal empire spread far beyond the financial district, becoming a symbol of hope for anyone who had ever felt overlooked, underestimated, or powerless in the face of injustice. Henry Morrison had proven that moral courage doesn't require wealth or position, that truth is more powerful than corruption, and that sometimes the most important person in the room is the one nobody bothers to notice. On quiet evenings, Henry would sometimes walk past those concrete steps where he had eaten so many solitary meals, remembering the pain of those days while appreciating the journey that had led him to vindication and respect. The steps remained unchanged, but everything else had been transformed by the simple decision to choose truth over silence, justice over comfort. The elderly man, who had once been invisible, now served as a reminder that dignity exists in every corner of society, that wisdom can emerge from the most unexpected sources, and that sometimes the greatest victories come not from those who wield power, but from those who wield principle. Henry Morrison had become a living testament to the truth that integrity, patience, and moral courage are the most valuable assets anyone can possess, worth more than all the cryptocurrency and stock portfolios in Manhattan combined. 5 years have passed since Henry Morrison walked back into Carlyle Financial Tower as Director of Building Integrity, and his influence has extended far beyond the marble halls where his story began. The building itself has become a symbol of corporate accountability and ethical business practices, attracting companies who want to be associated with integrity rather than quick profits and corner-cutting schemes. Henry, now 78, moves a bit more slowly than he did during his custodial years, but his sharp memory and moral clarity remain as strong as ever. His office has become an informal gathering place where employees from all levels of the building hierarchy come to seek advice, share concerns, or simply sit quietly with someone who listens without judgment and offers wisdom earned through decades of observation and experience. The Martha Morrison Memorial Dining Hall has evolved into more than just a cafeteria. It's become the moral center of the building, where conversations about ethical business practices happen naturally over coffee and sandwiches. Henry often sits by the same window where he once ate alone on cold concrete steps, but now he's surrounded by colleagues who value his insights and friendship. The federal investigation that Henry's evidence made possible resulted in convictions that sent shockwaves through Manhattan's financial district. Jonathan Prescott received a 23-year federal sentence for money laundering and investment fraud. Sarah Chen was sentenced to 18 years for tax evasion and international financial crimes. Marcus Carlyle, as the leader of the criminal enterprise, received a 30-year sentence and forfeiture of virtually all his assets. But perhaps the most lasting impact of Henry's courage has been the changes in how financial institutions approach accountability and oversight. The Morrison Standard, named after Henry's methodical approach to observation and documentation, has been adopted by federal regulators as a template for internal monitoring systems that can detect fraud and corruption before they reach the massive scale that characterized the Carlyle financial conspiracy. Rebecca Thornton, whose grandmother's stolen bracelet inadvertently triggered the investigation, has become one of Henry's closest friends and most ardent admirers. She often brings her young daughter to visit Henry in the Memorial Dining Hall, wanting the next generation to understand that heroism comes in many forms and that the most important qualities, integrity, courage, and compassion, have nothing to do with wealth or status. The young daughter, Emma, is now 7 years old and speaks to Henry with the easy familiarity of a grandchild to a beloved grandfather. She doesn't understand all the complexities of his story, but she knows him as the gentleman who always has time to listen to her school stories, who brings her small gifts from his walks around the city, and who teaches her that being kind to others is more important than having expensive toys or fancy clothes. Henry's daily routine has evolved into something that honors both his past service and his current responsibilities. Each morning, he still arrives early at the building, but now he comes through the main entrance where the security guards greet him by name with genuine warmth and respect. His first stop is always the Martha Morrison Memorial Dining Hall, where he shares coffee with early arriving employees and sets the tone for the day through his example of dignity and fairness. The building's new culture under Henry's influence has attracted attention from businesses nationwide. Companies send representatives to study how Carlyle Financial Tower transformed itself from a haven of corruption to a model of ethical practice. Henry often hosts these visitors, sharing his philosophy of transparent communication, treating all employees with dignity regardless of their position, and maintaining vigilance against the subtle corruptions that can infect any organization when people stop seeing each other as human beings. The security monitoring system that Henry once used to uncover the truth about his own case has been upgraded with his input to become a comprehensive tool for maintaining institutional integrity. But Henry insists that technology is only as good as the human values that guide its use. He has instituted regular meetings with all building staff, from executives to maintenance workers, where concerns can be raised without fear of retaliation and where problems are addressed through dialogue rather than punishment. One of Henry's most significant innovations has been the creation of what he calls dignity circles, regular gatherings where employees from different levels of the organization sit together and share their experiences. A hedge fund manager might sit next to a cafeteria worker, a property investment analyst next to a security guard. These sessions, initially met with skepticism, have become some of the most valuable hours in the building's weekly schedule, breaking down barriers between different classes of workers and creating genuine understanding across traditional hierarchies. The transformation of Carlyle Financial Tower has not gone unnoticed by the broader business community. Harvard Business School has created a case study around Henry's approach to institutional integrity. The study examines how a person with no formal business education but deep understanding of human nature was able to create lasting organizational change in one of the most competitive and traditionally cutthroat industries in the world. Graduate students from business schools across the country make pilgrimages to meet with Henry, expecting to find a sophisticated management guru, but discovering instead a man whose wisdom comes from simple principles consistently applied. Treat everyone with respect, listen more than you speak, and never forget that behind every job title is a human being with hopes, fears, and dignity that deserves protection. Henry's story has inspired changes that extend beyond the financial district. Labor organizations have adopted elements of the Morrison Standard in their advocacy for worker rights. Federal agencies responsible for preventing white-collar crime have incorporated Henry's observational methods into their training programs. Most importantly, individuals across the country have found courage to speak up about injustices in their own workplaces, inspired by the example of a 78-year-old man who proved that moral courage can overcome even the most overwhelming odds. The legal proceedings against the Carlyle financial conspirators have concluded, but their impact continues to reverberate. The assets seized from Marcus Carlyle and his associates have been used to compensate the victims of their financial crimes, but a significant portion has also been dedicated to creating the Martha Morrison Foundation for Workplace Dignity, an organization that provides legal support and advocacy for workers who face discrimination, wrongful termination, or other workplace injustices. Henry serves as the foundation's honorary chairman, a role that allows him to help other people who find themselves in circumstances similar to his own experience. The foundation has already assisted hundreds of workers who were wrongfully accused, unfairly treated, or retaliated against for trying to expose wrongdoing in their workplaces. Each case reminds Henry that his story is not unique, that injustice exists in many forms and places, but that it can be overcome when people have the courage to stand for truth and the support of others who share their values. The Martha Morrison Foundation operates from offices in the Carlisle Financial Tower, occupying the same floors where some of the original crimes were planned and executed. The symbolism is intentional. Henry wanted to ensure that the space once dedicated to financial corruption would now serve justice and human dignity. The Foundation's mission statement, written by Henry himself, reflects his characteristic simplicity and moral clarity. Every person who works deserves to be treated with dignity, fairness, and respect. When these basic principles are violated, we will stand with those who have been wronged and work to restore justice. Emma Thornton, now a regular visitor to the Foundation's offices, has declared that she wants to be a helper like Mr. Henry when she grows up. She doesn't yet understand the complexities of federal investigations or financial crimes, but she has absorbed the fundamental lesson of Henry's story, that helping others and standing up for what's right are among the most important things a person can do with their life. The concrete steps where Henry once ate his lonely lunches have been preserved as part of a small memorial garden outside the building. A plaque there tells the story of Henry Morrison and Martha Morrison, honoring their memory and the lessons their experiences teach about dignity, courage, and hope. The garden includes plants and flowers that Martha would have loved, tended by building employees who have volunteered their time to maintain this living symbol of the values that now guide their workplace. School groups often visit the memorial garden as part of educational programs about ethics, courage, and standing up to injustice. Henry sometimes speaks to these young visitors, explaining that heroism doesn't require special powers or extraordinary circumstances, that it simply requires the willingness to do what's right, even when it's difficult, and the persistence to keep believing in justice even when hope seems impossible. The children invariably ask Henry how he found the courage to take on such powerful people with so much to lose. His answer reflects the wisdom earned through a lifetime of service. "I didn't feel courageous at the time. I was scared and alone and didn't know if anyone would believe me. But I realized that staying silent would mean that other people might suffer the same injustice that Martha and I had suffered. I couldn't let that happen if there was something I could do to prevent it." The ripple effects of Henry's decision to speak truth to power continue to spread in ways both large and small. Employees throughout the building now treat each other with a courtesy and respect that visitors frequently comment upon. The building's maintenance staff, once invisible like Henry had been, are now recognized monthly for their contributions to the building's operation. Their work is acknowledged not just in paychecks, but in public recognition, professional development opportunities, and genuine appreciation from their colleagues. The transformation has not been without challenges. Some of the building's new tenants initially resisted the cultural changes, particularly the expectation that executives would interact respectfully with staff at all levels. A few companies chose to relocate rather than adapt to expectations of ethical behavior and workplace dignity. But the vast majority have embraced the change, finding that their own productivity and employee satisfaction have improved significantly in an environment built on respect and integrity. Henry's influence extends beyond the workplace into the broader community. He volunteers at a Queens community center near his apartment, helping elderly immigrants navigate social services and workplace issues. His experience with federal investigations has made him valuable to people facing their own battles against injustice. He listens to their stories with the same patience he showed during his years of invisible service, offering guidance and support to those who feel powerless against larger institutions. The community center has named Henry as their Volunteer of the Year for 3 consecutive years, recognizing not just his hours of service, but the wisdom and hope he brings to people facing difficult circumstances. Many of the immigrants he helps are working in service jobs similar to his own former position, cleaning offices, maintaining buildings, preparing food for people who often treat them as invisible. Henry's example shows them that their work has dignity and value, and that they have rights that deserve protection. As Henry approaches his 80th birthday, his energy remains remarkable for a man of his age. He attributes his vitality to having found purpose in his later years, the knowledge that his experiences, painful as they were, have been transformed into tools for helping others and creating positive change. He often says that Martha would be proud of how their story of loss and injustice has become a story of hope and healing for so many others. The annual Martha Morrison Memorial Dinner has become one of the most anticipated events in New York's financial district, attracting business leaders, government officials, and community advocates who come together to celebrate ethical business practices and workplace dignity. The dinner's keynote speakers have included federal judges, congressional representatives, and business leaders who share stories about how Henry's example has influenced their own approach to leadership and corporate responsibility. But the most moving moments of each dinner come when Henry introduces recent recipients of the Martha Morrison Foundation's assistance, workers who have faced wrongful termination, discrimination, or retaliation for exposing workplace wrongdoing. Their stories serve as reminders that injustice continues to exist, but that it can be overcome when people have the courage to speak up and the support of others who share their commitment to fairness and dignity. The foundation has grown beyond its original mission of providing legal assistance to wronged workers. It now offers educational programs about workplace rights, ethics training for businesses, and advocacy for legislative changes that would strengthen protections for whistleblowers and victims of workplace discrimination. Henry's vision has become a movement that touches thousands of lives across the country. Henry's personal life has also been enriched by the relationships he has built through his work. Rebecca Thornton and her daughter Emma visit him regularly, and he has become a treasured part of their extended family. Maria Santos, the international client relations manager who first expressed doubt about Henry's guilt, has become one of his closest friends and strongest advocates for the foundation's work. The new security guard at Carlisle Financial Tower, David Chen, Sarah Chen's younger brother who was horrified by his sister's crimes and dedicated himself to making amends through honest service, often seeks Henry's advice about how to balance vigilance with trust, how to maintain security without sacrificing the openness and respect that now characterize the building's culture. Henry's apartment in Queens remains modest. He has resisted suggestions that he move to more luxurious accommodations, preferring the neighborhood where he and Martha built their life together. But the apartment is now filled with mementos of his later career, photos with federal agents who worked on the investigation, letters from workers whose cases the foundation has helped, artwork created by children who have heard his story and been inspired by his example. On quiet evenings, Henry still thinks about Martha and the life they shared before everything changed. But the pain of those memories has softened into something closer to peace. Knowing that her story and his have become part of something larger than their individual experiences of injustice. The love they shared and the principles they lived by have been transformed into a legacy that continues to grow and touch new lives every day. The $800 million empire that Marcus Carlisle built through decades of corruption has been completely dismantled, its assets distributed to compensate victims and fund programs that prevent similar crimes. The gleaming tower that once symbolized unchecked greed and moral blindness now represents the possibility of redemption and transformation. The same marble floors that Henry once cleaned in invisible service now support an organization dedicated to ensuring that no worker's dignity is ignored or dismissed. Henry's story has been told in congressional hearings on corporate accountability, featured in documentary films about white-collar crime, and included in ethics courses at universities across the country. But he remains most proud of the smaller, more personal impacts, the individual workers who have found courage to speak up about injustice, the managers who have learned to treat their employees with greater respect, the families whose lives have been made more secure through the Foundation's assistance. As winter settles over New York City once again, Henry Morrison can be found in his office at Carlisle Financial Tower, reviewing cases for the Martha Morrison Foundation and meeting with workers who need advocacy and support. At 79, he moves more carefully than he once did. But his mind remains sharp, and his commitment to justice burns as brightly as ever. Visitors to his office often comment on how different he seems from what they expect of someone who brought down a massive criminal conspiracy. They anticipate meeting a fierce crusader or a bitter victim seeking revenge, but instead they find a gentle man who listens carefully, speaks thoughtfully, and approaches even the most complex problems with simple questions about fairness, dignity, and respect. The wall behind Henry's desk displays a single photograph, not of his moment of vindication in federal court, not of his ceremonial installation as Director of Building Integrity, but of Martha in her cafeteria apron, smiling at the camera with the gentle warmth that defined her character and continues to inspire the foundation that bears her name. And you, have you ever felt invisible while you were the one holding everything together? Have you ever been blamed for something you didn't do simply because you were nearby and powerless? Have you ever watched injustice unfold and wondered whether speaking up would make a difference? Henry Morrison's story reminds us that every act of integrity matters, that every moment of patient endurance builds character, and that every decision to choose truth over comfort contributes to justice in ways we may never fully understand. Sometimes the most important battles are fought not by those with the most resources, but by those with the strongest principles. The story of Henry Morrison proves that heroism exists in every workplace, every community, every situation where people have the choice between easy silence and difficult truth. It lives in the night security guard who reports suspicious activity despite pressure to look the other way. It lives in the administrative assistant who refuses to falsify records even when threatened with termination. It lives in the maintenance worker who documents dangerous conditions despite being told to mind their own business. It lives in you whenever you choose to see the dignity in every person you encounter, whenever you refuse to judge others based on their circumstances rather than their character, whenever you stand up for someone who cannot stand up for themselves. The power that Henry Morrison wielded was never about access cards or security footage. It was about the moral courage that belongs to every person who decides that justice matters more than comfort, that truth matters more than convenience. Henry's legacy is not the criminal empire he brought down or the millions of dollars in stolen assets he helped recover. His legacy is the proof that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary justice when they refuse to accept that wrongdoing is inevitable, when they insist that dignity is not a luxury but a right, when they remember that being overlooked by others does not make them less important. Sometimes it makes them essential in ways that won't be understood until the moment when truth finally emerges from the shadows where it's been patiently waiting. The next time you see someone cleaning floors, emptying trash, serving food, or performing any of the thousands of jobs that keep our society functioning, remember Henry Morrison. Remember that their work has dignity, that their observations have value, that their experiences matter. Remember that heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they wear uniforms. Sometimes they carry mop buckets. Sometimes they eat their lunch alone on concrete steps while holding on to principles that are worth more than all the wealth in the world. Tell me your story in the comments. If this story touched your heart, leave a like and subscribe so it reaches someone else who also deserves to be seen, who also deserves to know that their work matters and their dignity is worth defending. For more stories that honor the quiet heroes among us, tap the podcast link on the left. Thank you for walking this journey with Henry Morrison and with us. Thank you for believing that integrity is more valuable than wealth, that truth is more powerful than corruption, and that sometimes the person everyone overlooks is exactly the person everyone needs to hear from. We'll see you in the next story, where we'll discover together that heroism comes in many forms, but it always requires the courage to do what's right, even when no one is watching. Remember Henry Morrison, remember Martha, and remember that in a world that often values appearances over substance, your character is your most precious possession. Guard it well, Use it wisely, and never forget that being invisible to others doesn't make you less important. Sometimes it makes you essential in ways that won't be understood until the moment when truth finally emerges from the shadows where it's been patiently waiting.